You are listening to the Hiking Radio Network, where we talk the walk with shows by hikers about hikers for everybody.
Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, the ultimate midlife crisis. Join Steve and his guests every week as he staggers from Georgia to Maine.
Hello and welcome back to Mighty Blue on the Appalachian Trail, sponsored by Trailtopia Adventure Foods. It's Thursday morning. We're already into April. Several thousand people are heading north on the Appalachian Trail. By now, the privies must be a shambles. I'm watching a few YouTubers establishing themselves and wondering who's going to be this year's favourite. They all have their stories to tell, so this week for episode number 81, I have a guest who also has a story to tell. His name is Ben Montgomery. He's an author, and his story is the New York Times bestseller, Grandma Gatewood's Walk. Now, I hadn't read the book when I spoke with Ben, believing I kind of knew the story almost from osmosis. You know, immerse yourself in trail culture for a few years and you magically know about this brave, defiant woman. Of course, and certainly not for the first time in my life, there was tons more to learn, so I think you're going to enjoy hearing about Emma Gatewood. I've gone international for this week's Other Hikes section. Udi Goran lives in Israel and he tells us about the Israel National Trail. Funnily enough, last week's guest, Ben Bonanti, or Juandura, you can tell I like saying that name, can't you? He told us that he'd hit the Israel National Trail in his recent hiking frenzy. Udi gives us more of a deep dive on this fascinating location for a hiking trail. We've also got a new book at the end, but I'm going to tell you about that when we get to it. In the meantime, it's breakfast time. When I was hiking, I'd wake up to my alarm, deflate my AirPad and contemplate my blah breakfast. Every morning I poured water into those different coloured paper bags, scrunched around the ingredients, not one of which had any association with fruit, and then eat that soulless gunk. I then find unhydrated powder and sugar in the crevices of the bag. Trailtopia's blueberry oatmeal is a bit of a novelty because it actually has real blueberries. Who'd have thunk? No gunk. It tastes great. The bag design ensures complete hydration and it really sets you up for the day. Try Trailtopia Adventure Food, the best of home cooking away from home. So now we've got somebody who I thought was going to be our first non-hiker, apart of course from my wife Diane, yet it turns out that writing about the Appalachian Trail was a spark for his own interest in hiking, and you hear that he's taken it a step further, so to speak. For part of our conversation, it sounds as if there's somebody whistling in the background, but it doesn't detract from Ben too much. Here's Ben Montgomery. Okay, I'd like to introduce Ben Montgomery, the author of Grandma Gatewood's Walk. Hi, Ben. How are you?
I'm very good, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Well, it's good to talk to you, and I can tell you straight away, I have not read this book. I've read lots of AT books, and I feel like I already know the story because there's so much, not mythology built up around it, but she's such an iconic type figure. I feel like I know the story, and I'm hopeful you're going to tell me some things about the story that I don't know about, if you know what I mean. And the first thing I want to ask you about is that I hadn't even realized the subtitle is The Inspiring Story of the Woman Who Saved the Appalachian Trail. Why did you choose that title with particular reference to saving the trail?
I make the argument in the book that that she had something to do with that. She was on the AT in 1955 for the first time, and the AT was in jeopardy, I think, of neglect. There were long stretches that were unblazed. There were segments that weren't being cared for in the way in which they're cared for now. And Grandma Gatewood did a couple of things. First of all, she got more attention than any previous thru hiker. And at that point, there were only 5 or 6 men who had come before her to do the entire thing in one fell swoop. But she brought a ton of attention to the trail. And I think it was just the novelty of her at her age being out there and trying to walk the trail in its entirety, that there were what amounted to an unprecedented amount of press. And I'm talking about stories that ran in newspapers across the country during her walk,
Right.
to include a couple of stories in Sports Illustrated magazine, a nationally circulated magazine, which at the time was only a year old, but was widely read.
Right.
And she was critical of, especially when she finished the trail, she was critical of the segments that were not cared for, not maintained. And so I think that criticism was felt by the Appalachian Trail Conservancy and by the various trail clubs that were charged with keeping the trail up, in shape, et cetera. And so the trail improved dramatically in the years after her walk.
It always takes a woman to sort things out, doesn't it?
Yeah, right. Yeah, she didn't pull any
fun.
punches either. She thought she'd been sold a bill of goods, and she had read about the trail in the 1949 issue of the National Geographic magazine, which was really the first big magazine piece that had been done on the AT. And it was 12 pages, color photos, and it said anyone in moderate physical condition could hayfoot, strawfoot from Georgia to Maine. And this is what she thought she was in for, was just an easy walk. And so when she finished,
if I could just interrupt you a second, I was actually I met a number of German hikers on the trail when I hiked it in 2014, and they've been sold a bill of goods as well, because apparently they show a documentary in Germany about every 3 months, and they only show the flat pieces of the trail. So a lot of these Germans came over thinking it was going to be a walk in the park.
How funny! Yeah, I didn't know that. That's hilarious.
Are you a hiker yourself?
This book has made me a hiker. When I started researching her journey, it should be the effort of every serious biographer to try to get into the head of his or her character. And so, I spent no small amount of time trying to get into the head of Grandma Gatewood. And it naturally occurred to me that I need to hit the trail. I need to be out of doors and testing myself against the earth. And
Right.
so in that stretch of time, 8 months or so, 10 months that I was doing the research, I walked more than I have in my entire life.
Wow. Where did you walk? Did you use the Florida Trail, or did you go up to the AT itself?
I spent some time on the Florida Trail. I spent a lot of time on the AT. I probably only put in about 200 miles total on the AT doing the research, but and that's there's a reason for that. 99% of the trail is different today than it was in 55, because they're constantly routing it for erosion and better hiker experience and that sort of thing. So, but I dropped in on the areas that were important to her and that I knew were the same now as they were then. But I started walking around Tampa, Florida, the second deadliest city in the United States in terms of pedestrian fatalities.
Oh, really?
Yeah, next to Orlando, interestingly.
Oh, dear.
I pitched the story to the paper here. I went without a car for a week in July of 2012 as I was doing research for the book, and it really changed my perspective on the whole thing. I think I learned something about myself and my environment. Living around here in this very car-centric area, living around here without wheels, it's you're taking your life in your own hands. I was almost a handful of times, and it's no easy task to get around without a vehicle in this part of the country.
Yeah, it's almost impossible. I remember I just go out the back in my house. I go out the back door into the garage, into my car. That's it. I hardly ever walk in my road. It's amazing, really.
Yeah, no, you're right.
So and I know your book's a very popular book, and it was a New York Times bestseller. And how have readers who are hikers responded to your understanding of through hiking, or is that not what you've put in there? I mean, have you been? I'm trying to think what the word is. Have you put in there your thoughts on hiking yourself?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the book is in a way, an ode to hiking. It not only covers Grandma Gatewood's first through hike, but also her second and her third.
Yeah.
So no small amount of the book is dedicated to the AT in particular, even though she did hike the Oregon Trail in between there. But I, I was the AT community, especially those who are serious hikers, are a sharp-eyed, smart, dedicated bunch, and I
And
really
critical.
did expect some. I expect some pushback on certain things. Nothing I reported was super controversial, but for instance, uh, you know, the ATC considers Grandma Gatewood her 1955 inaugural thru hike the first solo thru hike by a female. And I write in the book, the first time I know that it's ever been reported, she took a ride around a soaked section. In 55, there were two hurricanes that took
Yeah.
the same route up the eastern seaboard. And so the AT was waterlogged in a lot of places, but she skipped, in her own words, she skipped about 2 miles of the trail in a vehicle
Right.
going around a bog. And I thought people would notice that. And I thought they would, I thought it might lead to like some of the more intense thru hikers challenging that inaugural hike of hers and that record that she claims. That I haven't seen that. By and large, the trail community, the people that I still bump into, people on whiteblazes.net and elsewhere have really celebrated the book, and I can't even think of any criticism from a hiker.
I reckon she's lucky she didn't live in the time of Facebook, don't you? Because
Oh yeah, yeah.
she probably would have had it then. But I think it's such an extraordinary achievement what she did that this expression "hike your own hike" is terribly important. And pretty much she did a through hike anyway. I mean, all right, maybe she didn't touch every blaze, but then I suspect, as you were saying, so much of the trail was so different then. It wouldn't look like anything like the trail looks today. So
Yeah.
she's given that recognition, and by the sound of things, thoroughly deserves it as well.
Yeah.
And do you think you've done, you said, about 200 miles of the trail? Do you think, having researched and written about Mrs. Gatewood, that you've sort of gained an understanding of what it is like to walk 2,000 miles, and has it made you want to do it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've certainly got the bug. In fact, I just picked up two youth-size lightweight 30-degree bags today because
Oh,
as soon as my kids get out of school on May 25th, I am taking all three of them to. We're going to fly to Charlotte and get a ride up to Boone, and we're going to do the
cool.
last. We're going to go southbound and do the 258 miles, I think, from Boone to Springer.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
So it'll be me and I got a 13-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 9-year-old.
Do they know this, by the way?
They do.
Have you told them?
Yeah. They're actually really excited. They've bought into it totally, and are on board. We'll see what they say once we get out there. But that'll be the first. We're planning on spending the whole month of June out there,
Cool.
and that'll be the first like serious time I've put in on the AT, and I can't tell you how excited I am. I'm
I
really
bet you are.
looking
I bet you
forward.
are. Now, I want to look back a little bit, because I do a bit of cyber stalking on people, and I looked at your authors page on Amazon, and I can see that you're a journalist in Tampa, very close to me. I live in Parish, just south.
Sure.
For about 20 years, you're a journalist, and I see that you're also in the running for a Pulitzer Prize. And that's for a series called "For Their Own Good," about abuse in Florida's oldest reform school.
Right.
So that's pretty serious stuff. Was it that series and that nomination that pushed you into becoming an author? Because you seem to have an inclination towards narrative journalism, and so it's something else I read on there as well.
Yeah.
Is that what got you into it in the first place?
Well, yes, actually. I mean, you can draw a direct line from that series of stories to Grandma Gatewood's walk, and here's how. I was spending a lot of time doing investigative narrative journalism at the Florida School for Boys, which is in Marianna, Florida. And as I'm working on that story, I stumbled across another about an unsolved lynching from 1934 in which 5,000 people participated in the lynching of an African-American farmhand named Claude Neal.
Wow.
I wrote that story about 2 years later, and that's the story that somehow, I mean, it was widely circulated on social media, and it wound up in the hands of a literary agent in New York who read that and called
Oh.
me and out of the blue and said, "I don't think this should be turned into a book, but I wonder if you have any other ideas." And I sent her one paragraph about Grandma Gatewood, and it was, I knew very little about her. She's a distant relative, but I inherited the stories from my mother, who used to tell me once in a while about her great aunt Emma, who was the first woman to through hike the AT. And
Oh.
so I sent that to Jane, and she said, "Oh, I love this story. Let's do the one about the hiking granny." And so there is a direct line from the from the more serious investigative newspaper work to Grandma Gatewood's Walk.
So you didn't even have to pitch it to a publisher. You lucky man.
Yeah, I feel like I got really, really lucky, and that's now led to a second book that came out in October of 2016, and a third, which will be published by Little Brown in September of this year.
I see. I was going to talk about those in a minute, actually. Well, a little later, actually. So that was your. Had you written stories before with an intent to publish, or were you just not just? Were you a journalist and happy to be a journalist, or did the idea of writing a novel really appeal, or writing a story really appeal to you?
I guess I always thought about doing a book eventually someday. It's hard to be a writer of any kind without entertaining that idea, I think. So, but I had never come close to approaching the amount of work or the time required in doing, a piece of journalism that's 70,000 words. So what Grandma Gatewood's Walk was. Before, my longest stories for the newspaper, and these were very long stories. It felt like, were 6,000 or 7,000 words. And so you're doing that times 10. So this was my first stab at it, and I learned a ton in the process. It made me want to do it, again. So
Intuitively, one would think a journalist would translate well into being an author, but when you think about it, as you said, you don't write long form journalism, do you? Well, not very long form journalism. So I suspect getting to 70,000 words must have been a stretch, but more must have been an entirely different mindset.
it was a very different mindset. I did approach it like newspaper work, in the sense that I wanted to respect the time of the reader. I'm an impatient reader myself, and when I get the sense, reading fiction or nonfiction, when I get the sense that my time is being taken advantage of, it makes me irate. And so I approached this piece of work, which again is 70,000 words, with the sense that I don't want there to be a word wasted. I want to, just like a newspaper columnist or a reporter with a short word count would, I want to approach this in a way that respects that the reader is, spending time with me. And I hear that. So presumably I pulled it off in some regard. I hear that from readers. Not that it reads like a newspaper story, but there's a certain economy of words and a spareness to the story that folks seem to appreciate. So, I have every intention of replicating that.
One question that struck me to ask you, as a former journalist, or I presume you no longer are a journalist. I presume, is that correct?
I
You're now
still
full.
consider myself a journalist, just in the
Right,
sense
right.
that I feel like the word author is sort of hoity-toity in my mind. I don't know why, but I'm a reporter, and I'll always be a reporter. And I think the same is true for the word journalist and writer, or
Right.
what have you.
Well, that was the question. It was, did you, as a journalist, I presume you edit yourself, don't you? Effectively.
I am constantly self-editing, and when I get comfortable with a piece of work, then I send it to friends and trusted
Right.
colleagues for their editing. And then with the books, it goes through its own process of editing with the publisher. So you
I'm
have
sure.
someone who does what's called a line edit, where they make general suggestions and provide broader feedback and ask a bunch of questions of the text. Did you really mean this here? Or I get this impression here, and I'm wondering if that's what you're trying to say. And then it goes through a more finer editing for grammar and spelling and punctuation and things like that.
Right. Now, I know you mentioned was it your mother or your wife's aunt that told you about
My mother. It was my mother's
your mother?
great aunt.
So what, apart from the family connection, which is a very delicious connection to have yourself anyway, what was it about the story that really resonated with you, or was it just basically the publisher who recognized the good story behind it, or were you really attracted to the story to tell it yourself?
A couple of things. First, I was really surprised to learn that no one had given this woman serious biographical treatment.
Interesting.
And this is going back to 2011 or 2012 when I first started thinking of doing a book on her. Just surprised that there wasn't already a long piece of work out there, a long serious piece of work out there. And then I introduced, to explore whether there's the potential material there to do a book. You have to go do some legwork. And so I introduced myself to Emma's youngest daughter, Lucy, who was in her 80s at the time, and fortunately lived in Jacksonville, Florida. So I didn't even have to get on an airplane to go visit her. So I drove up to Jacksonville and introduced myself and told her what I was interested in and who I was. And I had brought some newspaper clippings with me to show her that I could write and I knew what I was talking about. We talked about our family connections and that sort of thing. And then I said, well, what exists besides the various reporters' chronicles of her tale as she traveled along? What exists in the way of her personal documents and things like that? And Lucy graciously gave me access to Emma's trail journals.
Fantastic.
Oh yeah, it was a score. And these moments of serendipity in our field are just wonderful. She had kept her mother's correspondence. Better than that, Emma kept scrapbooks that included clippings that were about her that I guess reporters had maybe sent to her home while she was hiking. And she edited them in the columns. So I don't know if you know this, but newspaper reporters once in a while make mistakes.
Surely not. Fake news.
But the beauty, I can't believe how fortunate I was in this regard, because Emma would take a pen and she would copy edit their newspaper stories and make the corrections in the margins. And so I thought, well, this is not just the basis of a biography. This is this material gives me the chance to get inside of her head on certain things. And it also was telling about her relationship with her husband, which was, an abusive relationship and she was married for 30 years. And Emma herself wrote about this quite often. And so having access to that was the element of surprise that I think a good book needed. You can do a great story about a woman hiking the first woman to hike the AT, but without understanding the why or having the material that provides answers to why she did it, it falls short. And I was lucky to have those.
So you had contemporaneous notes by her.
Yes.
Did you have any counter narrative? In other words, I'm trying to articulate what I actually mean by that. You had her story, the way she told it, and we all know when we tell a story, but we perhaps gloss over one and two things about ourselves, or quite a few people do. Did you have anybody tell you different stories that countered what she said, or did you just go with the journal?
There were some legends that existed. There was some folklore, let's say, that existed about her that I couldn't verify in her notes or in any of the paper coverage of her. And there's typically funny little stories, that I wish I could have used in the book. But one I recall, she was hiking the Oregon Trail and she needed a place to sleep for the night. And she stopped in a little roadside motel, and the proprietor mistook her for a hobo. And because she was, she was soiled and she'd she wasn't even carrying a backpack. So she had one set of clothing. And she looked bedraggled, and he thought she was a transient. And he said something to the effect of, "We don't accept your kind around here." And meanwhile, word had been out and in the newspapers about her planned trip to hike 2,000 miles of the Oregon Trail. And the governor of the state of Oregon had made her an official ambassador at large. And so she had official documents from the governor of Oregon. And she
Awesome.
took offense to this guy mistaking her for a transient. And she said, "Well, I'm Grandma Gatewood. I'm, sort of in a huffy tone, like I'm an official ambassador at large for the state of Oregon." And he said, "Well, I'm going to need to see some proof." And she bent over, the story goes, to get the documents out of her bag or whatnot, and a bunch of marbles spilled out of her blouse pocket and rolled across the linoleum in the lobby of the hotel. And she straightened up and said, "Well, I guess I've lost my marbles." And that sounds like too quirky and too good to be totally true. And I couldn't find any verification for it. So what I tended to do with stuff like that was just leave it out. The book was too good with stuff that could be confirmed.
So you basically, because that was my next question, was about how were you able to sort fact from myth? You literally did, as a good journalist would, get a second source, did you, in pretty much every case?
Yeah, pretty much every
as far as you could. Yeah, as far as you could.
I sent the manuscript to a friend of mine named Earl Swift, who's an accomplished author in his own right, has 4 or 5 books out. He's also a thru hiker, class of 1996, I think. And I just wanted him to read it and make sure I was hitting the right notes for hiking and things like that. And when he finished, we had a conversation. He was like, "Hey, how sure are you that she did this?" And it took me back. I was like, "What?" I said, "What do you mean? How sure am I?" It's in her notes, and there are newspaper clippings from every town she walked through, and it's not like you could have coordinated a fraud on that scale. Besides that, there were reporters from the Associated Press and UPI with her every single day for the last 2 weeks of her trail as she neared Mount Katahdin. So, like,
oh, really?
You can't make that stuff up. And Earl said, "Well, I can't believe, knowing what she was eating," which often she would beg food from people who live near the trail or eat, otherwise survive on what was to be found alongside the trail, wild berries and sorrel salad, as she called it, and a varmint or a critter every once in a while when she could cook something over a fire. He said he was eating something like 6,000 calories a day and still losing weight. And he had a hard time that understanding that a 67-year-old woman could eat what she was eating and not, and continue to hike. And she lost 30 pounds. She went from 150 to 120 during during her hike.
Because they say a lot of women don't lose that much weight. The men lose a lot of weight, and the women tend to tone up. But if she was starving herself, which she probably was, then that's probably the answer, isn't it?
That was my best explanation, but I appreciated him applying that kind of scrutiny to the story, because I wanted, this happens, right? I mean, it happened to Earl Schaefer, with people picking apart his story in every detail. I didn't want to be the guy who had to 5 years down the road or whatever to admit that, I'd been fooled or that there was something incorrect about the story.
Did you ever get an impression that she was so unprepared and continued regardless, or was it because she was expecting it to be a walk in the park? Because if she was expecting it to be a walk in the park from what she'd heard or read, then after a couple of 100 miles, she would have had enough, I would have thought, because it turns out, I mean, she went with no tent, sleeping bag, no pad, no backpack, and she wore, I think, tennis shoes or some other sort of shoes. And you mentioned earlier on that she was on the Oregon Trail also with no backpack. So this is something that she was unprepared, but she continued to be unprepared. Is that correct?
That's correct. And not only that, she had the opportunity to purchase better gear, visiting trail towns along the way, and she rarely did. Often she would just replace her shoes if they were coming apart. She walked through 5 or 6 pair of shoes the first trip, but no, the evidence I have of that is the second time in 1957 when she showed back up at, this time it was Oglethorpe, I believe, in Georgia. she brought essentially the same stuff. She brought a shower curtain to
Did
keep
she?
the rain off, an army blanket, and no tent, no sleeping bag, nothing like that. So it was available to her. I think she just appreciated the simplicity of her meager belongings. And if she could make it through two back-to-back hurricanes that first trip, what else
Yeah.
could
Yeah, yeah. Did you like her? I know you didn't met her, but did you like her from what you understood of her?
I'll tell you what, Steve, I really kind of fell in love with her. You know, she became a real person to me, and
Sure.
an interesting anecdote, perhaps near the end of the writing. My writing schedule was really tight. I want to say I did 70,000 words in about 90 days. So I was trying to do
Wow.
1,000 words a day. And I was coming to the end, and the thing is all outlined on paper attached to the wall in front of my screen. And for about 3 or 4 days in a row, I would go to the office and sit down to write, typically after dark, and I would start crying, and I couldn't figure it out. And I was telling my wife about this one day. I said, I'm stuck. I can't hit my word count because every time I go try to write, I'm crying. And she says, "You don't want her to die." And she was right. It didn't occur to me, but I was actually writing her toward death. I knew it was coming next, and it was
Wow.
like I was mourning for her as I was. I knew what happened, right? I knew the end of the story. She died 5 years before I was born, so but I felt like this sense of mourning, um, and it was just an indication to me that I gotten to know her and to like her so well. I hope that shows in the book.
What did you gain personally from her story? Or is just the telling of a fascinating story sufficient for you as a writer? Did you learn something about yourself through what you were writing about there? Maybe that was it. You fell in love with the woman who was dead before you were born.
I feel like I really got a better sense of how the pedestrian has lost ground in the society in which we live. And I've become an evangelist for walking, not just in nature, but also in urban areas. And I've become aware of the burden that the pedestrian-minded person alive right now has in terms of fighting back against the complete domination of the automobile. Uh,
Yeah.
I think our health, our physical health, and our mental health have taken massive hits because we no longer walk, because we have the option of sitting and riding now, and we choose to do that far more than we do just getting out on foot. And we're fatter now than we've ever been, and we're more mentally diseased than we've ever been, and we don't see we see the answer in medication or in fad diets or whatever, and we don't realize that, look, we were bipedal for 6 million years as our main means of transport, our own 2 feet. And only in the
Mm.
past 100 years or so have we been given the option of sitting down and going somewhere. And,
Sure, sure.
and we're facing, whether anybody realizes this or not, we're facing, in my mind, the result of that choice, the consequences of that decision. When she walked in 55 is a fascinating decade. The cars were booming, the interstate highway system was being built. The national magazines were full of advertising that said, don't leave your wife stranded in the suburbs, buy her own Buick. Um, in 1950, 8% of American households had television sets. And by the end of that decade, by 1959, that number was 80%. So there was a dramatic shift in how we exist in this world
Yeah.
in that period of time. And we're right now dealing with the consequences. So it changed me profoundly. My friends now get sick of hearing me talk about how let's walk 10 blocks to the store, to get a beer or whatever, instead of driving. Why do we need to drive? And
Maybe that's what people discover when they go on a hike like that, how it's this simplicity of having everything you need on your back and your legs, your only necessary means of transport, and it's pretty damn perfect out there. There's very little of that's in the woods that isn't pretty darn perfect. And I can, from the way in which you've just said it, it makes a lot of sense to me that this is something that we were born to do, but rarely do these days. And those of us who get in the woods from time to time, it's good for our soul, I'm sure. It certainly was. It was a massive thing for me when I did it. Now it's changed me profoundly since I've come home as well. And I suppose writing this book about a lady who has through hiked, does it give you a view of the physicality of the task of a through hike?
I can't. Yes, I mean, I certainly not just writing about her, but reading a dozen or so books about through hikers or by through
Yeah,
hikers helped fill in the gaps that I didn't get from Emma. But yeah, I have an enormous amount of respect for people who can pull that off.
cool.
Yes, it's I think the thing that most Americans face is this: uh, we get caught up in the rat race, and it's so hard to pull ourselves out of the mortgage,
Sure.
away from the mortgage payment or car
Yeah,
payment, or
yeah.
who can take off from their job for 4 or 5 months to go hike in nature. But it's such an important thing, I think.
Well, I'll tell you what, Ben, I get, and I'm sure you do, as you've written about this book, you must get hiking related questions and emails and letters. I get emails literally every day from people thankful for hearing the stories of people who have done this or have had an association with the trail, because it's made a lot of the people, certainly of my generation and lower them and younger than my generation, realize that there is no deterrent to doing it other than your own circumstance in life. Obviously, you've got kids in college, you can't do certain things. But a lot of people write to me say, the moment I'm retired or the moment my last child leaves college, I'm going to get out there. And it's a wonderful thing that books like yours and hopefully a program like this inspires people to get out there and actually do it. So more strength to them as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. And you deserve a chunk of those props. Obviously, the more we can spread the word, I think the better it is for all of us.
Totally. Now, just you mentioned your other books. You've got a really interesting preview video of the leper spy. Actually, I think it was done before it was released, but this is about this spy in the Philippines who spied for the Americans.
Yes, sir. Spy for the
That
Americans
looks
in the
interesting.
Philippines, and she came up with she worked with the Philippine underground resistance when the Japanese occupied the Philippines during World War II.
Yeah,
And she was good at being a spy because because she had leprosy, and the Japanese were
yeah.
culturally horrified of leprosy. And so it tells the story of her efforts during the war to steal state secrets and map Japanese gun emplacements. And
Cool.
I make the argument that her work went a long way toward helping the Americans win the war in the Pacific. Without her, we might have found it much more difficult to take back the Philippines.
How did you find that one then? Because I saw there's a video of her walking with a bunch of American servicemen. I think they looked quite high ranking servicemen in the video as well. How she must have been pretty celebrated at the time then.
She was very celebrated. There were stories in major American newspapers and national magazines about her, primarily because after the war, she was trying to get to the U.S. so she could get proper treatment for her disease, which had ravaged her country. Medicine was very
Yeah,
hard to get in the Philippines. So a lot of
yeah.
Americans went to bat for her to get her the first
Cool.
ever foreign the first ever visa for a foreigner with leprosy, so that she could come to a little place called Carville, Louisiana, to a hospital
Huh.
that was on the cutting edge of treating leprosy victims.
How cool. Sounds a good story. Now, the other one, please tell me this is a hiking book. The Man Who Walked Backward. I guess it's not, though, is it?
I just saw an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day about people needing a bigger challenge to running marathons. So you're starting to see men and women run them backward.
Oh, my God.
In that vein, it may be a hiking book as much as running a marathon backwards is a running story. Very quickly, in 1931, a guy named Plenty Wingo lost his little cafe in Abilene, Texas, to the bank. This was the
Uh-huh.
front end of the Great Depression, and the
Yeah,
Dust Bowl had
yeah.
started swirling in West Texas and elsewhere. and he couldn't feed his wife and his kid. And so he decided that he would try to get rich and famous by walking backward around the world. And so he left Fort Worth, Texas, going in reverse on foot, and made it all the way to Istanbul, Turkey, before he hit a snag. The book tells the story of his misadventures, and he gets into all sorts of shenanigans along the way. And so it is a walking book, but it's a walking backwards book.
How cool. Well, look, I'm so delighted that you are doing some hiking and you're taking your kids on the trail, which is wonderful. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. It's a fascinating story, and hopefully we've pulled a little bit more out than perhaps was known before. And I really appreciate you spending the time. So thanks very much indeed.
Oh, you're very welcome, Steve. And thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about her.
Okay. Speak to you soon then. All the best. Bye.
Bye.
I love to hear people's why, don't you? It was a journalist and found that he had Grandma Gatewood's story in his family, so he wrote it. I also love that he said that he fell in love with her and didn't want to write about her death. How sad that must have been. It's funny, but one of my abiding takeaways from my 2014 hike was the number of strong, and I called them fearless, young women I met on the trail. Well, who knew? Grandma Gatewood was the forerunner to those women more than 60 years ago. No wonder Ben fell in love with her. And what a treasure trove for a writer. He got her journals, and nothing can beat a contemporaneous account. Great story. After my rant last week about my book review, here's a nice 5-star podcast review from Lion Whisperer. He says, and I'm presuming that Lion Whisperer is a guy, enjoy your perspectives on the AT as well as the journey of all your guests on the show. Thanks, Lion Whisperer. We enjoy sharing them. And a shout out to Cynthia Cadell. Cynthia reminded me in an email not to get upset by nasty comments. You're right, Cynthia, and I appreciated the reminder. Just before we get on to Udi and the Israel National Trail, I wanted to ask your opinion. This middle section of the show has had several different identities. There was
If I Hit It Again.
Then we had
Fear and Loathing on the Appalachian Trail.
There was the wonderful Doc Spot with Dr. Lynn, and now there is the occasional Other Hike section. I guess most prominently we had Jessa Hackman, or Addie, hiking last year. A few weeks ago I asked for current hikers on the trail to get in contact with me if they have stories to share, but it seems that they don't. I'd still like to hear some of those stories, so get in contact if you have something to share. We really want to hear from you. One of our previous guests, Julie Gayhart, or Jester, said that she'd like to hear more about post-trail depression and its impact. I'd love to do that, but I wonder how comfortable people will be sharing those stories. I'd be perfectly happy if you'd like to remain anonymous, so give it some thought, those of you who have suffered from this phenomenon. We can record you, it will be entirely anonymous, and you'll contribute to the debate. But I want to stress that this program is for you, the listener. If you feel that there's a segment that we can do, or just one story, please let me know. Email me at steve@mightyblueontheat.com or reach out to me on Facebook. Now, here is Udi Goren and the trail in his own backyard, the Israel National Trail. Right, I'd like to introduce a young man, Udi Goren, who's going to talk to us about the Israel National Trail. Hi, Udi, how are you?
Doing very well, thank you.
Good. Well, thanks for coming on the show. To be honest with you, this is I'm trying to put different hikes in the show, which are not the Appalachian Trail. Yet this is a really substantial trail, isn't it? Tell us something, I know you live in Israel. Has this been something you've hiked regularly or just the once?
So one of the big advantages of the Israel National Trail is that it's very easily accessible. So maybe in comparison to the Appalachian Trail, where you really, for some sections of it, you really have to put an effort to get there. With the Israel Trail, you can practically get to any part of it just for a day hike.
All right. Nice.
So I've visited many parts of it in other occasions before I've done it consecutively and after I've done it consecutively. And actually now we're right before Passover, which is a long vacation that we have. So I'm definitely going to see some part of it in the next week or so.
Do you hike by yourself or do you go with somebody?
I normally try not to go by myself for safety reasons, just because it's not very smart to hike by yourself. I sometimes do, especially if I'm taking the camera. The good thing about hiking in Israel, well, good or bad, depends on how you look at it, is that you actually can get cell reception practically anywhere. So
Nice.
in terms of safety, if I have my cell phone with me, then I feel that if anything happens, I can always make a call and get some help.
Now, you mentioned safety, and how close are you to the various disputed areas? And borders, and perhaps one or two of the other settlements. I mean, I really don't know enough about Israel, so please forgive my ignorance if that's a stupid question.
No, no, not at all. The question is absolutely in place. So in Israel, what I would say, aside from the borders, so we have a border with Lebanon and a border with
Yeah.
Syria that at times are tense. At this point, the border with Syria is kind of, and the southern border with Egypt and the eastern border with Jordan, who are both usually very safe. And then we
Right.
have the separation wall between us and the Palestinians, and this is usually where tension may rise. So the trail on purpose was moved from the separation wall, and it doesn't go very close. There's one bit of the trail where you actually walk right along the separation. Well, some parts it's a wall, some parts it's a fence. So you actually walk alongside the separation fence for
Right.
not even an hour, probably. And it's a very low tension area, so nothing really happens there.
Do you know what? That's I find that really sad. Are there? And this is once again, I may very well be cutting this one out, but
Mhm.
this is a question I'm just gonna ask you.
Yeah.
Are there any hiking clubs where the Palestinian Jewish people and the Jewish people go hiking together deliberately for the reason of hiking together?
There are at least two that I know of.
Good.
It's always in the context. So hiking is just the catalyst, or the excuse to have another form of a meetup or of an encounter.
Right.
So it would
Right.
always be with some, peace building or bridge making agenda. So it wouldn't be a hiking club, just a regular hiking club that anyone joins, and it would be mixed, Israelis and Palestinians. It would be an organization that has an agenda and uses hiking to get people together.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's fair enough. And how much of the trail? I've only been to Jerusalem before, so I haven't seen much of Israel. How much of the trail is in desert, and what are the water implications of that, or is it the fact that you're so close to towns it almost doesn't matter?
So that is true until you reach the town of the city. That is true until you reach the city of Arad, which is in the northern edge of the desert. So the desert
Uh-huh.
is a third of Israel. So it's also a third of the trail. I
Oh,
would,
right. Okay.
yeah, maybe a little bit more than a third. And in that regard, then you're pretty much set. It's pretty easy until you reach the northern part of the desert. And from that point on, what really dictates your walk is where you find water. So for a few days, the trail is segmented in a way that at the end of every day, you find water.
All
And
right.
then there comes a point where for about 5 days or so, there's no water.
Oh
And then
man.
you have two things that you can do. One, and that's what a lot of people do, that's what I've done. You drive ahead of time and you bury water in campgrounds. So you make a map or you just log it, and you know exactly where water is waiting for you along the way. And
Okay.
the other option is that there are people who made it their business to either bury water or hide water in strategic locations. Or the third option, you pay someone to get water to you at the end of the day. So
That's a bit of a logistical thing to think about, and that's fair enough. Why wouldn't you have a logistical thing? I mean, 5 days without access to water would be obviously impossible.
right,
So you've got to make some preparations for it. And
exactly.
is that as difficult as it sounds, or is it relatively straightforward?
No, no, it's not that hard. It's really not that hard. I think the biggest challenge is, and I clearly remember before setting out on the trail, I was so preoccupied with it. And then I've decided, all right, I really don't know enough about the way this is going to turn out in order to
Right.
take care of it now. But then after you're on the trail, so I've hiked from the north to the south. So by the time I reached that point, I was already a month and a half into the trail. I knew exactly how much water I needed, how much water I can carry, how much I can walk a day, what I would like to do when I'm in the desert. So then I could really make a very conscious decision on where I should leave water, and to be safe about it, to be smart about it. And so I just left it to the middle of the trail. So I hiked with a hiking partner, and we took a day off. By chance, my dad had a day off. He got a pickup truck. He came down to see us. We drove all the way to the end of the trail, buried our water, came back, and then went on with the hike.
Cool. Cool. So as far as the length of the trail, it's about 1,000 kilometers, something like 1,000 kilometers long.
Yeah.
And are there designated camping sites? I presume there are not shelters there. Are there designated camping sites, or can you just camp anywhere?
So in some parts of the trail actually go through nature reserves, and like anywhere in the world, you have to stay in a campsite. You can't
Course.
just stay anywhere. But aside from that, you're pretty much, you can pretty much set camp anywhere. So there are some if you're looking for water at the end of the day, so you don't have to carry it with you, it makes it easier if you just pick, not even necessarily a campsite. Sometimes you just stay at the backyard of this monument where they just have a tap, so it's easy to stay there.
All right. What was the origin of this? Is this a new thing, or is this part of a I don't know whether pilgrim is the word, but a pilgrimage type thing, like the Camino in Spain? Were people originally heading on this trail to Jerusalem?
No, actually, I think you'd like this trivia. It was inspired by the Appalachian Trail.
Even better. Happy days. Oh dear.
One of Israel's leading naturalist figures went to visit the eastern U.S. He heard about the Appalachian Trail. He hiked a little bit of it, and he came back to Israel, and he said, "We have to have this." So he went to the Society of the Protection of Nature, which they're responsible for trail markings in Israel. So Israel,
Okay.
this is also something not many people know. Israel actually has one of the world's best trail marking systems in the world. Miles upon miles of hikes are marked in Israel, very thoroughly, very professionally marked. And
Nice. Nice.
yeah, absolutely. So he came back to them. He told them about his idea. It took 15 years to actually make it happen. So in 95, they actually finished marking the first version of the trail, which was moved afterwards, as I've mentioned. And but it all started with the Appalachian Trail. Now,
So
really,
what's the Israeli version of the white blazes then?
so it's you can probably see it on my site. It's a colorful marking. It's a white stripe, a colored stripe, whatever color, and another white stripe. That's the normal trail marking. It could either be, blue or red or green or black. These are normally the markings. The Israel Trail is different. So the stripes are white, blue, and orange. White because we have one annually snowy mountain all the way up north on the Syrian border. So that's the north. Blue because of the Mediterranean Sea, and orange because of the sand in the desert.
Right. Is there much elevation then? You say up in the mountain there, or is it a relatively flat hike?
So, some days are more difficult than others. Israel is not flat. It's northern Israel, the Galilee is, well, in American standards, it's hilly. In Israeli standards, it's mountainous.
All right. Okay.
And in the south, there's actually some strenuous hiking days. Some days with some serious elevation differences. So you would definitely have a few days that you would really have to work hard on the hike. So this is also why it makes it physically easier if you start from the north, because then you have a lot of time, to get into it and build up towards the south.
Makes sense. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. And how close are you to the biblical sites?
You actually go through some of them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2012, National Geographic voted the Israel National Trail as one of the world's best 20 long distance hikes. And one of their reasons was the proximity to the biblical stories and the fact that you can actually walk through some of them.
So how close do you get to Bethlehem and Jerusalem?
So not very close. So because Jerusalem is a high friction area, and also East Jerusalem is considered to be the West Bank. It's considered to be a disputed area, and Bethlehem is in the West Bank. So the trail doesn't actually go through there. It goes through the edges of of Jerusalem. So the trail goes up into the Jerusalem mountains, goes into the western neighborhoods, and then turns around and goes back to the lowlands. But what you do walk through is where, according to tradition, David fought Goliath. You actually walk through this site.
Oh, cool. That's, I mean, I'm not a religious person, but I find the history of in that would be so evocative, I would think, to walk through those places.
Absolutely.
And that would be a lovely thing to do. Now, one last thing, which is that I understand, I may be entirely wrong here, but I read this in Wiki Travel, so it must be right. It says there are trail angels there now. Is that right?
Absolutely. So
fantastic.
We copied that from the Appalachian Trail, but I can say with pride that trail angels in Israel actually went a step further. And the norm with trail angels in Israel is that they host the trail hikers in their homes. That's the norm standard. So all you need to do, there's actually a list online. You give them a heads up a day or two in advance. And if they have room, you can come, you stay there for free in their own house, in their personal space where their family lives, where they cook, where they live, and you stay with them. And all you have to do is be a trail hiker.
That is so cool. Well, thank you so much for talking to us. I think it's fascinating. I'm learning more and more. I do these podcasts, and more of a diverse nature. Hiking is all over the world, and I think I'd love to branch out to one or two other countries and see what they can offer as well. But I really appreciate you coming on the show and talking to us.
Sure, my pleasure.
Okay, Maddie. Well, thanks very much, and I'll speak with you soon. Okay.
All right.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm such an idiot. I thought it would be some mystical, long-lost pilgrimage trail, perhaps the road the Crusaders took back in the early Middle Ages. But no, it was done in the 1990s, based upon the AT. I'd imagine it must be quite the trail to walk, though I can't say I'd be thrilled to turn up where I thought I'd buried some water, only to find a whole lot of sand and no idea where I'd actually buried my cash. I like the idea of the Jewish and Palestinian hikers getting together. I can tell you, several nights in shelters with a bunch of other hikers on the AT, we solved all of the world's problems. Without all the BS to distract you, you can get a lot done. Talking of controversial topics, next week's guest is Daniel White, or the Appalachian. Several people suggested Daniel to me before I eventually reached out to him. You see, I didn't want to interview a black hiker. I wanted to interview a hiker who just happened to be black. There's a huge difference. Mind you, when Daniel and I recorded, we spoke about his lived experience, and I wish I'd spoken with him earlier. Now, you're probably expecting me to be reading John Muir's story about his first summer in the Sierras. I started recording it, but I had to stop because of the flipping Latin words for all the plants he saw. It just about drove me crazy. So I need a book to read, one which I can get permission to actually read on the show. If anybody can give me a good suggestion, I'd happily follow up. I did try for Grandma Gatewood, but Ben had sold the audio rights. For now, though, I'm just going to read my own short 8-chapter prep book called Hiking the Appalachian Trail is Easy, especially if you've never hiked before. You can actually get the free ebook at my author site, steveadams.info. If you can't be bothered to do that, close your eyes, settle back and listen. This week, in the first chapter, I tell you about getting ready to go into the woods. I'll see you next week. Hiking the Appalachian Trail is easy, especially if you've never hiked before, by Steve Adams. Chapter 1, First Thoughts. This short book is intended to show anybody, both young and old, that hiking the Appalachian Trail does not need to be a dream to be left on the shelf. I've met a lot of folks over the course of my life who have wanted to do something, yet never committed fully to the process. Of course, there are many people physically unable to take on a long-distance hike. Strike that. There are many who think that they are physically unable to take on a long-distance hike. If you can walk 200 yards without needing to rest for a week or require access to oxygen, then you can hike the Appalachian Trail. The only question that will be asked of you on the trail, day in and day out, is whether you really want to or not. I can speak with some authority on the subject. In 2014, at the age of 61, I eventually made the commitment to meet this challenge head on. I was overweight, or under height, as a friend of mine used to say, underprepared and utterly ignorant on the subject of hiking. Despite the unpromising confluence of these three attributes, I embarked upon an adventure that enriched my soul and continues to weave patterns in and out of my life. I told the story of my journey in 2 volumes, My Appalachian Trail 1, 3 Weddings and a Sabbatical, and My Appalachian Trail 2, Creek and Geezer, Hidden Flagon. If you'd like to know what it's like to actually do the hike, you may want to check out those 2 books. Until I set out from Amicalola Falls State Park in March 2014, I'd never hiked, nor had I slept in a tent. On that first day, I did both. My hope with this book is that you will see that such an adventure is open to anybody who can propel themselves 200 yards along a path. My guess is that at least 95% of those reading this will be able to clear such an unremarkable hurdle, but at least 99% will do nothing about it. Isn't it time that you join the 1%? Like many of my fellow travellers, Bill Bryson introduced me to the Appalachian Trail. His story gave me an impression of the trail that turned out to be quite unlike anything that I eventually experienced. Don't get me wrong, I love the book, and I've always enjoyed Bryson's writing. However, a walk in the woods gave me a clouded, general impression of what I would face. It didn't prepare me for sitting up in my tent in the middle of the night, deep in a forest, fully awake from a noise, and entirely alone. The book didn't convey the physical exertion needed as muscles engaged, then disengaged, over the 5 million steps estimated to complete the 2,185.3 miles of the 2014 trail. Neither did the book conjure the raw excitement of seeing 4 bears descending from a couple of trees and running away from me. In my opinion, no book can really prepare you for life on the Appalachian Trail. While Bryson's was my favourite, I read roughly 20 others that served to excite my senses, yet completely failed to get me ready. I very quickly came to the conclusion that it is only by putting one foot in front of the other that you can start to understand the essence of the AT. I go further than that. I believe that I may have even benefited from knowing absolutely nothing about how things were going to be. Consider the ability of children to take on life without fear. As a parent, you worry constantly about your kids' safety. You see the issues that they brush past. Their approach is joyful, uncomplicated and determined. On the AT, I was a kid. I had wanted to do it for a long time and didn't have time to consider problems in my way until they were right in front of me. To be frank, it was precisely this thinking that excited me in those early days. I was a non-hiker and revelled in that fact. If you're a non-hiker, then you will certainly learn as you go. I hope that these few thoughts will colour your experience in some small way. The day before I set out, my wife and I were whiling away the day in a small town in Georgia. Browsing in a bookstore, I came upon yet another Appalachian Trail book. The cover had drawn me to it, so I glanced inside. The first line I saw was in a list of reasons to hike the trail. The line read, "It must be the thing you want to do more than anything else this summer." I read it 3 times, asking myself the question. Every time I whispered back, "It is." I loved my life and I loved my wife. I knew that I'd be missing long days on the beach, evenings together at our favourite restaurants, and generally hanging out with her. She was and remains my best friend, and I knew I'd miss her. That said, the trail was calling me, and it was what I wanted to do more than anything else that summer. That articulation served me well throughout my hike. I was grateful that the thought had formed to allow me to let go and embrace the adventure. I'd been nervous about those first few days, but felt that this line gave me permission to get started. Of course, I entertained ideas way above my station at that time. I was going to become an older Bear Grylls, the British adventurer. He's the one who performs death-defying feats, existing on a diet of grubs and insects. I was clearly delusional, as I was a fat 61-year-old with neither the experience nor skills to take on such a challenge. I've never been one to let reality stand in my way. Typically, for me, I told everybody what I was going to do before I'd taken a single step. This slightly premature behaviour led a friend to reach out to Summer Smith, a local Bay News 9 TV reporter. Summer graciously agreed to interview me a few days before my trip. Looking back at that interview, I cringe as I watched my newly shorn scalp glistening under the camera lights. I'm speaking with Summer as if I had been trekking through jungles my entire life, as opposed to wandering slowly around my neighbourhood for a couple of weeks. I show off my brand new backpack, still sporting its sales tag, and my pristine solar charger that is going to provide me with power for my iPhone. The ignorant oaf who is pretending to be a younger, fitter, more impressive man is setting himself up for catastrophic failure, the nature of which he can't begin to fathom. How's that for chutzpah? Despite these obvious danger signs, Summer's interview highlighted how excited I was to be going on my own adventure. I'll always be grateful to her for helping me to keep my blinkers on at this stage of my preparations. I had no idea what was going to happen, but being blissfully unaware of any potential pitfalls kept my glass half full. There was an instant spike of interest in my blog once the interview aired, and I was further buoyed by this additional support. It was only once I'd started walking that those blinkers fell away.